Good wishes to all of you. Philosophy of service, an approach to human development in India and the problems of our working class. Swami Ranganathananda. The philosophy of service, the problem of interhuman relationships. When I look around me in the India of today, the one theme that strikes me as of the greatest benefit to our nation is the subject of service. Our society bears the impress of all forms of exploitations and that too for centuries which man has practiced on man, intellectuals exploiting the common people, the rich exploiting the poor, rulers exploiting their subjects, and man exploiting women, and often women also exploiting each other. Every form of exploitation we have indulged in here that alone explains the low level of life, individual and collective, that we have had for the past few centuries. As a result, we have had to pay a heavy price, centuries of political subjection and all forms of social humiliation have been heaped upon the people of India, rich and poor alike. They should have opened our eyes, but today, after 20 years of political independence, we notice that we have not learned the lessons of history. All the maladies that afflict our people today, all the troubles of our body, political proceed from one single source, and it is that man in India had devalued himself. He has not realized his own dignity and worth as man. He has not recognized the dignity and worth of man in his fellow man. This is the subject that should become the sheet anchor of our education and public life today, so that we may achieve nation building on the only foundation on which it can be raised, namely what Vivekananda called man making. The building up of a great modern nation out of the diverse elements of our society, with millennia of history behind it, is not an easy task. It calls for a new type of manhood and womanhood with deep convictions within and a tremendous willpower to translate visions and ideas into real forms outside. Swami Vivekananda, more than 70 years ago, referred to this need when he expounded his thesis of a man mankind, education, and a man making religion. He said that religions of the world had become lifeless mockeries and that what we needed was character. These religions, as lived and practiced by millions, hide behind their exterior petty aim a good deal of selfishness, social callousness, and violence. This has distorted our history, retarded our nation growth, and thwarted our national purposes. Religion in India had long become reduced to a form of petty, fringed worldliness. The above words of Vivekananda have become of topical significance for our nation today when, after 20 years of independence, we have begun to despair of our nation's future. When we have begun to be unsure about the stability of our infant democratic state, which we instituted with such enthusiasm and fanfare in 1947 and 1950. Renunciation and service. Therefore, the one subject that should hold our attention today is the subject of man and the subject of interhuman relationships. What is a form of interhuman relationship that is conducive to gender happiness and welfare? Man has exploited his fellow human beings throughout history. We are generally familiar only with one type of exploitation, namely the economic, which has been highlighted by Marx and his school of thought. But exploitation can be and has been of other types as well. Whatever surplus resource a man possesses, he can easily use them to exploit other people. The other alternative is to utilize one's surplus energy, intelligence, wealth, and power to serve other people. To enhance the life of other people, why has our nation chosen the first instead of the second alternative since our independence? Swami Vivekananda had proclaimed about 70 years ago The Complete Works of Swami Vivekananda, 1997, Volume 5, page 228. The national ideals of India are renunciation and service. Intensify her in those channels, and the rest will take care of itself. Renunciation of the little self with a view to manifesting the higher self and the spirit of service are the twin ideals of India. In the wake of our great national renaissance of the last century, the country did inspire itself with the spirit of renunciation and service, and through bands of dedicated workers in all parts of India for the cause of India's freedom and India's nation building. As a result of their contributions, the country became free and ended its centuries long stagnation and slavery in 1947. Why we failed to continue in that great mood and temper thereafter is a mystery. It is amazing how a people emerging from the darkness of their slavery of centuries to the light of freedom could easily forget the lessons and warnings of their history and cease to be creative. History is replete with instances of nations bursting with creative energy on emerging from a spell of political slavery. The classical example of this is Athens, when it succeeded by united and sustained struggle in defeating its Persian invaders and freeing itself from their brief but deeply galling yoke. Athenian democracy experienced an ecstasy of freedom which issued forth during the next 50 years in an outburst of creative activity in every department of its national life, cultural, social, political, and artistic, which has brightened not only its own but all subsequent Western history as well. Why did we fail to experience a similar sustained ecstasy of delight on the attainment of freedom, not after a brief spell of slavery, as in the case of Athens, but after centuries of bondage? And why did we allow our creative energies to dry up within a few brief years of independence? With the drying up of our creative spirit, we soon slipped back into our erstwhile stagnant phase, into moods of complacency and ways of selfishness and self centeredness. This is the tragedy of our brief post independence history, and we have paid the price in shocks of military defeats, economic disasters, political disintegrations, and social upheavals. Where everyone sought only his or her own happiness, no one is happy today. The need for creative thinking. This phenomenon is imparting a salutary lesson to us, the ethical lesson of mutuality and interdependence. The current maladies of our nation are inducing a mood of thinking and self criticism among our people, and this is the brightest side of our national life today. Creative thinking is the sure sign of the onset of social health. All growth, development, and progress flow from thinking. Our nation has started to think after 20 years of what, in the language of Vivekananda, may be called not thinking, carelessness. We have become aware of the mess in which we are, and we have begun seriously to consider how we can get out of the get out of it. This is a sure sign of the onset of a trend towards health, towards national creativity. We have to sustain this trend, intensify it, and say goodbye to all complacency and its evil fruits of selfishness and self centeredness. Let us think together as to how to restore our nation to health and vigor. Biology tells us that man is an interthinking species, the only such species in creation. He advanced evolution through this interthinking process. And this is the work that we shall engage ourselves in during the quiet hour that we are together here. And this is the work that all patriotic citizens should engage themselves in when they meet together in groups. It is in this context, against this background, that I wish to discuss this great subject of the philosophy of service. We have been using the word service mostly in a professional sense. We have the union services, the state services, and a host of other services. I'm not here to deal with them except as part of the wider field of interhuman relationships in general and the philosophy underlining the same. The search for a rational ethics. Service, as I said earlier, in the finest form of interhuman relationship. It involves a growth, a change for the better in the individual man. What is the change? What is that growth? Throughout these centuries, we have failed to discuss and comprehend this great subject because for centuries together, our forms of interhuman relationships were expressed in set forms and fixed molds where growth of the human personality had no meaning. They were not rationally determined, but were determined by caste factors, by conventional religious dictations, and they yielded frozen patterns of conduct and behavior, whose goodness or badness was derived from the authority of a text or of a caste mandate. We fail to develop a rational ethical code deriving sanction from human nature itself and capable of sustaining human conduct and behavior in turn. What our nation needs today is a pervasive concern for man as man, and not as cut up into castes, sects, and communities, and the formulation of a sanction for the same from the rational ethics and spirituality. Every human being is faced with the challenge of the presence of other human beings in the society. He can react to the social milieu either in a friendly way or in a hostile way, depending upon his concept and assessment of himself. He chooses the hostile way when his only concern is his own survival and his own organic satisfactions. When these are his predominant motives, his behavior is not far removed from that of animals. No actual human being, however, is always motivated thus. Even the lowest of human beings does sometimes experience a genuine concern for one or more other human beings. In this, he seems to outreach his own limited self. This betokens the emergence of moral awareness in man. Its culture, growth, and development represent the specifically human phase of evolution according to 20th century biology. Evolution and ethics. 19th century biology could find no place for ethical sense and moral behavior in its theory of evolution. Ethics and evolution run parallel to each other. As expressed by Thomas Huxley in his Evolution and Ethics, evolution meant struggle for existence and survival of the fittest, whereas ethics meant the making of as many as possible fit to survive. But the revolutionary advances in this science in the 20th century have made ethics central to evolution at the human stage. Speaking on the evolutionary vision, Sir Julian Huxley, a noted contemporary biologist and grandson of Thomas Huxley, gives a spiritual orientation to the evolutionary process. Evolution after Darwin, Volume 3, page 251. Man's evolution is not biological but psychological. It operates by the mechanisms of cultural tradition, which involves the cumulative self reproduction and self variation of mental activities and their products. Accordingly, major steps in the human phase of evolution are achieved by breakthroughs to new dominant patterns of mental organization of knowledge, ideas, and beliefs, ideological instead of physical, psychological, or biological organization. Discussing in the light of the revolutionary advances of 20th century biology, the aim of evolution or evolution at the human stage as greater fulfillment. Sir Julian Huxley says Ibid Volume 1, page 20. In the light of our present knowledge, man's most comprehensive aim is seen not as mere survival, not as numerical interest, not as increased complexity of organization or increased control over his environment, but as greater fulfillment, the fuller realization of more possibilities by human species collectively and more of its component members individually. And pleading for a scientific study of the scope of this concept of fulfillment, Huxley concludes. Ibid page 21. One's greater fulfillment is recognized as man's ultimate or dominant aim. We shall need a science of human possibilities to help guide the long course of psychological evolution that lies ahead. It is the science of human possibilities, that constitutes the spiritual core of the world's religions, and it is the central theme of our Upanishads and the Gita. Psychosocial evolution. What is meant by psychosocial evolution? In a self centered man, as in all animals, the psyche or mind or soul is limited and confined to the physical organism. In a moral man, it expands, goes beyond the barriers of his physical organism and enters and is entered into by other psyches of the social milieu. Men develop a capacity to dig their affection into each other as a matter of conscious choice, thus revealing a higher dimension to the human personality than what is revealed by his physical personality with its organic appetites and choices. This registers the beginnings of the manifestation of the spiritual man lying behind the physical man, of his higher self behind his lower self. All ethical theories presuppose this distinction between a higher self and a lower self in man. And the liberation of his higher self is what man achieves through ethical endeavor. It is renunciation of the lower self and manifestation of higher self. Unless he erects himself above himself, how poor a thing is man, sings Wordsworth. Accordingly, what we see in all moral and ethical phenomena is a growth of man in a non physical dimension. This is his spiritual growth, a growth in his inner dimension in which, as pointed to by Sir Julian Huxley in his lecture on the evolutionary vision, quality emerges as the criterion of evolution for the first time in place of quantity, which dominated organic or pre human phase of evolution. I spoke of quality. This must be the dominant concept of our new belief system. Quality and richness as against quantity and uniformity. Discussing the subject of utility against this new belief system, Huxley says, once we truly believe that man's destiny is to make possible greater fulfillment for human beings and fuller achievement by human societies, utility in the customary sense becomes subordinate. Quantity of material production is, of course, necessary as the basis for the satisfaction of elementary human needs, but only up to a certain degree. More than a certain number of calories or cocktails or TV sets or washing machines per person is not merely unnecessary but bad. Quantity of material production is a mean to a further end, not an end in itself. And highlighting quality as the dynamics of human evolution, Huxley concludes. Thus, the evolutionary vision illumines our existence in a simple but almost overwhelming way. It shows us our destiny and our duty. It shows us mind enthroned above matter, quantity subordinate to quality. This is what Vedanta recognizes as the spiritual evolution of man as his inward journey to fulfillment in the context of his outward life and movement and action. The spiritual growth of man. The subject of the spiritual growth of man is a fascinating theme relevant to the contemporary world situation and more so to man in the Indian context today. It will point out to him the way to rescue himself from the tyranny of the sensate and the quantitative and from the prevailing stagnation of worldliness and help him to continue his evolutionary march to qualitative richness and fulfillment. Physical growth, we understand, intellectual growth also. Though less obvious, we can understand, but what is this other growth? The moral and spiritual growth of man. It is something subtle, yet real, and more significant than the other two. So far as man is concerned, moral awareness with its capacity for love and service is the direct fruit of this spiritual growth. This growth registers itself as an expansion of man's interests and sympathies so as to embrace increasing numbers of fellow human beings and in the consequent extension of the frontiers of his own self. Without this growth, man's body becomes the prison of his self. With this growth, it becomes the finest instrument of human evolution of man's journey to fulfillment. With the evolution of the higher brain in man, organic or physical evolution has ceased to have any further relevance so far as man is concerned. With the inventive powers of his higher cerebral system, man can produce organs and tools far more efficient than what nature may evolve within his organism at her slow pace through her trials and errors and enormous waste. Evolution has become self conscious in man with his whole host of new capacities like reason, imagination, memory, and will. If organic evolution is thus irrelevant at the level of man, and if evolution still continues in him, it has to be sought beyond the organic or physical level. This is the meaning of what Julian Huxley refers to as psychosocial evolution. It is conscious social participation that makes an individual grow even into a personality, a value which no animal can realize. Biology speaks of the principle of homeostasis or homeo- homeostasis, by which nature effected an automatic stabilization of internal condition in the organism of the higher mammals. This helped in the slow evolution of the brain until, in man, she perfected the higher brain. The organism's need for physical survival and organic satisfactions, and her own need for numerical increase. All these have been relegated by nature to the care of man's lower brain, thus realizing his higher brain to function as the most wonderful instrument for carrying evolution to its specifically human fields, namely the psychosocial, moral, and spiritual. The capacity and fitness of the higher brain to undertake and fulfill this high function is directly proportional to its freedom from slavery to man's sensory apparatus and its appetites, to the pressures and pulls of lower nature. The higher brain, with its powers of reason and imagination, may stultify itself by functioning as the tail end of the sensory apparatus. It may, on the other hand, redeem itself and also man by becoming true to itself, by becoming truly higher. It is ethical discipline, what Vedanta calls sama and dhamma, discipline of the mind and the sense that helps the higher brain to thus redeem itself and become the agent also of man's redemption. This is the reason in its true form, what Vedanta calls buddhi, referring to the evolutionary significance of this development of the higher brain. Neurologist Gray Walter, in his book The Living Brain, exclaims, for all mammals, homeostasis meant survival, but for man, emancipation. This, the spiritual growth of man, is this a fact. The more we know the science and technique of his growth, the better for us and for our nation. Physical and intellectual growth, we know and recognize the second less palpably than the first. A baby is born with about 7 pounds of body weight. Every day it increases in weight. It drinks its mother's milk to be followed by other types of food and drink. And it grows steadily until it becomes a full grown healthy man or woman of 150 or 200 pounds. This is the palpable physical growth of man, and we ensure it by appropriate means of physical nourishment. Equally important, though less obvious, is his mental growth. A village boy is timid and without confidence. He is sent to school. Within a few weeks, he gains in knowledge, in alertness, in self confidence. He develops a sense of his individuality, and this continues until he becomes, maybe, an intellectual gain or a gain of will. This is the mental growth of man, which we ensure through appropriate mental nourishment, through education, institutional and non institutional. These two types of growth are necessary, but not sufficient. There is a third growth, most vital and significant, but least recognized, without which the other two will provide prove his undoing, without which his search for fulfillment will result in unfulfillment and defeat. This is his spiritual growth, which finds expression in ethical awareness and social feeling to begin with, and finds its consummation in the experience by him of the infinite, universal, and divine dimension of his personality, the Atman. Intellectual gains versus moral pygmies. An education that does not stress the spiritual growth may produce physical and intellectual gains, who may as well be moral pygmies. This is what India calls the Rakasa type of men, physically strong, intelligent, and of strong will. But all this held in thraldom to his finite, lower self, to his sensate nature. It is not oriented to his larger self through moral sense and social feeling. In fact, this is the defect also of our contemporary Western civilization. According to some modern thinkers, modern civilization creates intellectual gains and moral pygmies. So, what is the difference? The difference is precisely here. The body has grown, the mind has grown, and yet the real man has remained a puny, tiny thing. It has failed to grow for want of the spiritual nourishment relevant to its growth. So, the spiritual stature of man, his spiritual nourishment and growth is not a mere academic subject, it is a vital subject for man, individually and collectively. Civilization cannot survive without the spiritual growth of man from out of himself. In India, our great philosophy of Vedanta emphasizes the spiritual quality of human life. It proclaims that man is essentially divine. He is not the body, he is not the mind, he is not the Atman, infinite and universal. The body and the mind are only the instruments of his spiritual growth, the means of his life purposes, which include sense pleasures and aesthetic delights, intellectual developments, and ethical awareness, and the fullest realization by him of the freedom of his inborn divine nature. The nature of ethical awareness. This spiritual growth of man finds its first expression in ethical awareness, in social feeling, in a genuine concern for the other individual. The society of human beings constitutes the milieu of his spiritual education, of his spiritual growth and development. Man lives in two environments, the natural and the social. But most people recognize only the first and not the second, or rather treat the second as but an appendage of the first. But the second is something distinctive. Nature around us, with its starry heavens, with its rivers, mountains, trees, houses, tables, and chairs, constitutes the first environment in which we conduct our lives. Man explores this environment for his purposes, and it is meant to be so exploited, for it has no purpose of its own. A table is meant to be used by man, so also the house, so also the earth and the air, the rivers and the mountains. But the second environment in which human life is cast, without which human life will become elementary in its proportions, is the social environment constituted of other human beings. This is an essential environment for the growth of the human spirit. Take a man away from society, he will become like Ramu, the wolf boy of Lucknow. He will not grow into a human personality for want of conscious participation in the social environment. Therefore, the importance of the social milieu is recognized in all ethical philosophies, in all political and social systems. What does it involve to have a social milieu? I live in an environment constituted not only of natural objects and processes, but also of other human beings. What are these other human beings? It is this question and man's answer to it that constitute the challenging problem of interhuman relationships. Man's advocate response to this challenge raises his life from the organic or the physical to the ethical and the spiritual levels. Every human being treats himself as a subject, as an end value, and treats everything else as an object, as a means to that end value. That is human experience in the raw, ethically unprocessed state. The table and other things are objects, and I am the subject. The objects are not meant to serve the purposes of the subject, and I am that subject. This idea that objects serve no purposes of their own, but are meant to serve the purposes of a subject, it recognized in the dictum of the Sankhya philosophy quoted by Shankara in his commentary on the Brahma Sutra. Samhadanam pararthavat purusasya samhatanam pararvata purusasya. All samhitas, that is objects which are but combinations of elements, do not serve their own purposes but are meant to serve the purposes of a subject, namely man. Recognizing a subject in a social object. Now, when I apply this idea to myself, I recognize that I am that subject, and everything else belongs to the category of the object meant to serve my purposes. But when man extends the application of this dictum from the natural to the social environment, he commits a serious ethical blunder. He becomes the exploiter of his fellow human beings. He considers his wife to be an object. He treats his children as objects. So also his servants and all other human beings. Therefore, this tendency to exploit other human beings proceeds from the failure to recognize the distinctiveness of the social environment from the natural environment. Wherein does this distinctiveness lie? It lies in the unique fact that other human beings constituting the social environment are not just objects, are not just extensions of his natural environment, but are subjects like oneself. Ethics, therefore, asks man to detach himself from his physical self and to view the social environment as it is in itself. This detachment helps him to liberate his higher self and view his social environment objectively. He then discovers anew that social environment consists not of objects but of subjects like himself. This is the discovery that led man to culture and civilization, to ethics and spiritual realization, that led him on the specifically human road of evolution. Therefore, ethical attitude can be defined as the recognition of a subject in a social object. There are two types of objects: natural objects and social objects. Social objects consist of human beings, and when I recognize the subject in a social object, I express my ethical sense and I being to treat that social object not as a means to my ends, but as an end in itself. With the development of ethical sense, man also learns to treat all non human living things more and more as ends in themselves. This at once involves a revolutionary change in interhuman relationships. Whereas, as an object, man exploited man just as he exploited his houses and furniture, rivers and mountains as a subject with ends of its own. Man serves his fellow man and helps him to realize his own ends. Each man becomes at the same time the means and the end with respect to the social environment, revealing the truth of mutuality and interdependence underlying that environment. This is the truth that humanity has failed to realize adequately from the very beginning of history. Barring a small minority of ethically sensitive people, most human beings have treated and still treat other human beings more as mere objects to be exploited than as subjects to be served to realize their own needs, own ends. Service, its mood and temper. Therefore, ethics comes to us with a great message, the message of interdependence, the message of mutual service. It proclaims that if one wants to achieve his own welfare, he must strive to ensure the welfare of other human beings also. As exhorted by the Gita, 3rd volume, 11th. Parasparam Bhagavanta, Shreya Param Avapsyata. Cherishing and serving each other, may you achieve the highest general welfare. The German philosopher Kant defines ethical attitude in a beautiful sentences. Says he is, says he in his metaphysics of morals. So act as to treat humanity where in thine own person or in that of another, in every case as an end, never only as a means. Each one is an end. Each one is an end in himself. Each one is also a means with respect to his fellow men. In the light of this attitude, a study of interhuman relationships reveals the utterly unethical and low nature of all forms of exploitation of man by man. When man when men exploited women in feudal societies, he treated her not as a person with ends of her own, not as a subject, but as an object meant to subserve his own ends. The same treatment was meted out by him to servants, laborers, and other sections of society. But today, in the context of our democracy, we are required to reverse this wrong attitude and practice and treat every human being as an end in itself. In this way, interhuman relationships become transformed, revealing the growth of man in a new dimension, namely his spiritual dimensions, and the fruit, the byproduct of this growth is the temper and mood of service. The spirituality of this mood and temper expresses itself as a sense of privilege with respect to work. It is my privilege to serve the ends of others through my work. Proclaims this mode the husband or the wife, parents or children, every member of a society, by being engaged in enhancing the happiness and welfare of others, enhances not only his or her own happiness and welfare, but ensures his or her own spiritual growth as well. This also reveals the third environment in which man lives, namely his inner environment, the world of his inner life, besides the other two, namely the external natural and social environments. It is by taking due note of this is it is by taking due note of this third environment that man ensures a spiritual growth in the context of his external life and action. Nourishment of his inner life is achieved through the spirit of dedication and service with which he inspires his outer life and action, which then becomes transformed into yoga, which achieves the double efficiency of social welfare through productive labor outside and spiritual welfare through the inward spiritual attitude of dedication and service. This double efficiency, productive, social efficiency outside, and spiritual personal efficiency within, is the message of yoga. According to the Gita, second volume, 50. Yoga Karmastu Kausalam. Yoga is efficiency in action and not any cheap mysticism or magic. Mysticism or magic. Service, therefore, is the only valid form of interhuman relationship in any society which aims, in the words of Julian Huxley, quoted earlier, at the fuller realization of more possibilities by human species collectively and more of its component members individually. Thank you. We will meet at other part. Thank you.